I'm Ken Ledeen. I'm a tech entrepreneur.
Hi, I'm Wendy Seltzer, W3C.
Hi, I'm Harry Lewis. I'm a computer science professor at Harvard, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 298 for November 14th, 2022. And I've got a really fun interview today. It's a panel interview. I've had, a couple times in the past where I interviewed, I think, 2 people. That's the most I had done at a single time. And we've got 3 today, 3 of the 4 authors of a book called Blown to Bits. And I'm still working through it. I've been so backed up on everything else in my life except working on the 5th edition of this book. I've got so many things I want to catch up on, but I read a good portion of this book and skimmed all of it in preparation for this interview. And it's really great. If you are in a position where you need to understand the basics of technologies and the implication of a lot of those technologies, this is a fantastic book. It covers an amazing amount of ground, and it's written for non-techies, kind of like, my book. But it's just amazing how many different stories this covers. There's so many wonderful anecdotes in this book, and it really covers so much ground. And we are just going to scratch the surface of that today. But it was a lot of fun interviewing Wendy and Harry and Ken all together. They've got great stories, and you're going to hear a few of them here coming up. And before we start, I've just got to say, I put together that clip at the beginning where they all said Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons in unison. They did not do that originally. I actually offered to see if they might want to try that, and they all said no. But hey, I managed to make it work through the magic of audio editing. So this book was written actually with the idea of trying to educate people in positions of responsibility about how the internet works. And it was at least somewhat inspired by Ted Stevens, senator, on the Senate floor, talking about how the internet is a series of tubes, and how that analogy was really, really pretty poor. And more to the point, it was quite obvious that this particular senator didn't really understand how this stuff worked. He was talking about net neutrality. And so that was one of the things that spurred the creation of this book. But also we talk about how people, even in the computer science field, people that know software and hardware and computers and the internet tend to be very focused. They get very siloed and they kind of lack a view of the big picture. And this book brings all that together. So anyway, I'm going to ask these guys a whole bunch of questions around this and you'll see that we get some really great answers. Before we do that, we rattle off, I guess, a few terms I don't think we defined. One is the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force. These are the guys behind most of the specifications that make up the web. And followed right behind, of course, is the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. And Wendy is here representing the W3C. All of these groups are working behind the scenes to help make your internet more compatible, more usable, and these days more private and more secure. All right, so let's not waste any more time. Let's get to our wonderful interview with Wendy Seltzer, Harry Lewis, and Ken Ledeen. We've got 3 great people on the show today. And instead of me introducing all of them, let's start by going around the horn. And why don't you introduce yourselves? Harry, why don't you start?
Hi, I'm Harry Lewis. I'm a mostly retired professor of computer science, been teaching at Harvard since 1974, and my claim to fame is that I've had both Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg in my classes.
Oh, wow.
And hi, I'm Ken Ledeen. I'm a technology entrepreneur, and one of my great claims to fame is in 1965, I taught Harry Lewis how to program.
And Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Seltzer. I'm a lawyer and technologist with the World Wide Web Consortium, where I am counsel and strategy lead. We seek to use standards to make the web better for the world.
Fantastic. And the reason you are all here, and the reason the thing you all have in common as far as I'm concerned, is you are all co-authors on a book called Blown to Bits, which just came out with a new edition, and I'm working my way through it right now, and it's a fantastic book, covers amazing amounts of ground, and we're going to touch on a little bit of that today. So why don't we all start with, what brought you 3 together, and why did you guys write this book?
This book emerged out of a general education course that I taught at Harvard. Back starting in around 2005, and which I pulled Ken in to help me with, and and the motivation for that was just that I could see the world was changing drastically because of the explosion of digital information, and there were a lot of people who weren't thinking about the consequences, and they were letting others make decisions about the consequences. And Harvard educates a lot of great computer scientists, like the 2 dropouts that I mentioned. but but also educates large members of judges and Congress people and others who are going to have a big influence on the world, and I wanted them to understand it. So I pulled Ken in because I've known Ken since we were in college together, and Hal Abelson is a co-author also, is an old friend at MIT. And Wendy brings a whole set of knowledge and skills that neither Ken nor I nor Hal have.
So the first edition of this book came out in 2008. So I'm curious to know what's happened since then that has most surprised you.
There are lots of things that have been quite a surprise. Many of us were involved in artificial intelligence back in the 60s. And then, as we know, there was a long AI winter. One of the big surprises is the degree to which AI has really risen to a point of prominence with enormous implications. And we'll talk about that later in this discussion. We had this idea that if programmers write programs, people can understand what the computer is doing, and that's not really true anymore. So that, for one, has been a really big change. In some ways, the pervasiveness of this technology at every level, it's amazing to see young kids be really technologically competent. So this has been, we often talk about the fact that the digital explosion, which is part of the title of this book, was perhaps the most significant event since the creation of written language. And we're really seeing those implications in the world today.
I would add to that, one of the things that makes this an important subject for people to understand in a way that's different from the way it was 25 years ago is that stuff works now. In the days when I was learning about computer technology, some of these ideas, as Ken has mentioned, were in the air as possibilities, but nothing really worked. And there's been such, and therefore you had to understand how it worked, because you couldn't, otherwise you wouldn't be able to use it, because it never really quite worked and did what you were supposed to think. The technology has now advanced to the point where, yes, we've made it more usable by ordinary people, but the effect of it being so functional is that people no longer think of it as technology that they can control or have any choices on. It's just there. It's just like, it's part of it's like the interstate highway system. Nobody thinks about building the interstate highway system until you run into a section of it that's being repaved. And then you think a lot about the infrastructure, right?
Right.
So in computer technology, very often now we don't think about the infrastructure. We don't think about who's collecting the data, where it's being used, how it's being repurposed, and all of this stuff, because it's all so seamless now. And that's a change that's really accelerated over the last decade.
And Carrie, if I could add just one more, I'm sorry, Wendy, let me just, before I completely forget this idea, is one of the things that I observed, and Harry has talked quite a lot about, is that scale changes things. And one of the things that we've really seen in the last couple of decades is that the amount of data that is stored and is accessible changes the kinds of things that can be done. And we see this in areas like language translation. We certainly see it in areas of privacy where so much information is available. I mean, vast amounts. Part of this is because the cost of storage is so low that things that were conceptually possible became actually possible because the scale of the data changed dramatically.
And if I could pick up on that, I think one of the things that continually surprises me is the effects of scale surprise us even when we're expecting things to change as they scale upward. And so, I noticed that particularly in trying to understand the debates around misinformation and its effects on polarization of dialogue, on electoral politics, on safety, that even as we realize that speeding up communications and expanding audiences will change the way we communicate, we still see quantum type shifts in the way the information environment behaves, and asymmetries, and how to defend our democracy against that, how to defend our communities against misinformation or poisoned discussion.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the big things, obviously, that's happened since the first edition of the book was the Edward Snowden revelations. And I've said many times on the show how much it's affected me. I'm curious to know from your guys' perspective, what do you think the impacts of that have been? I really thought, honestly, there would be more fallout from that. I thought there'd be more changes that came out of that, but maybe they were more subtle. What do you think has come out of this, good or bad?
One thing I've seen is it really affected the technical standards community and people working in technology to see their tools and constructs being poked at as though they were Swiss cheese. It caused people in the standards bodies like IATF and W3C to go back to first principles. What can we do to secure our systems better? Prompted a lot more conversations about end-to-end security, making sure that we're not relying on technology in the middle of our networks to secure the communications, but that every participant can be encrypting and passing encrypted blobs to the other end. And so I think it spurred a lot of creative development and work to build more secure technologies from the ground up. And that's given us a lot more of the building blocks for secure communication.
What other impacts do you think that those revelations have had, like about on policymakers or on legislation? We still haven't managed to get privacy laws really here in the United States, but has there been any benefits in that regard? I mean, some of these programs have supposedly been shut down. I don't know. What do you think?
This is a very good question. And because the real question that I'd like to know the answer to, which I don't know the answer to, is how many more conversations now happen in the bowels of the intelligence and securities and military offices in which someone says, yeah, we could do this, but aren't there some issues that we ought to think about before we actually go ahead and do it? Because there are some risks and some downsides, and this would be hard to defend if it ever, So do people have those conversations more, or do they just up their game at keeping things secret and making it impossible for people to carry stuff out of their contractors' offices on small memory devices? I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies claim that all these privacy-enhancing technologies are making it hard for them to keep us safe. But, on the flip side, privacy advocates say that we're in the golden age of surveillance. With that as a segue, you brought it up. What are the real answers here? How do we figure out how to draw that line? How do we protect, our citizens and yet respect their privacy?
I want to just think a little bit about where the last question was left as we segue into this one, because I've been, number one, I wonder whether some of the questions that you just raised about what do intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies do in their conversations to consider whether something that can be done should be done. That particular mode of thought should be applied really everywhere. And it's very hard to do. As Wendy pointed out, even people who are extremely knowledgeable about technology have a very hard time thinking about the implications of what they're doing. And I think we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that even well-intentioned people can get wrong the implications, but those conversations really do have to exist. And the second piece is that my observation is that unless something is seamless to the point of invisibility, the general public doesn't do it. So we've known for a very long time that email is like postcards, and if you really want to keep it private, you should encrypt it, and hardly anybody does. We wouldn't have had all of the Hillary email issues if all of their stuff had been encrypted. But even in a context like that, where you would think people would be using encrypted email, they don't. And so it's very interesting that somehow pushing this back to say, those folks over there have to do it for me because I don't want to take any responsibility, is an important factor in how we move forward.
I just want to say, this tension that you described between the law enforcement and and privacy advocates, you're quite correct, is unsettled business. I'm actually reasonably hopeful. Well, I'm hopeful and worried at the same time. But there does seem to be a moment here where, for maybe not the best of reasons, there is a significant possibility of some federal privacy legislation in the coming in the next Congress. The reason, unfortunately, is that the hatred of the tech industry is one of the few things on which the left and the right in America seem to be able to agree. And so whether the privacy legislation will be the best, serve the country's interests the best, remains to be seen. But I'm proud to be a member of the board of EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is very active in working towards this. So I have some optimism. The discouraging note that I want to say at the same time, and there's lots of state level privacy legislation going on also, is that the current Supreme Court of the United States has cast some doubt on whether it believes that there is any constitutional right to privacy at all. And I don't know where else that thesis, which became evident in the Dobbs decision, might rear its ugly head in the context of efforts to pass privacy legislation. So, I think we're in a state of affairs where more than ever people need to understand and think and give their voices to what their concerns are.
Computer systems are often viewed as cold and calculating, and are they less biased than humans when making decisions? And if computer algorithms do have a bias, where does that bias come from, and how does it manifest?
So I think computer systems are perhaps less likely to be capricious. If you feed them the same question, they'll come back with the same answer time after time. But they absolutely can be biased, and unfortunately, as more pieces of our environment get computerized, they are often filled with hidden biases. So the bias could be intentional, a programmer maliciously saying, let's discriminate against a class of people. It could be a bug. The software just doesn't recognize something as a last name that is in fact the last name of many people on the planet. And I think most pernicious is the biases that come in from sort of training on historical data that reflects a legacy of bias in our society. So a lot of what we see as computerized now is systems built on machine learning and artificial intelligence, where they're fed a corpus of background data and decisions made based on that data in the past, and told, now replicate those decisions. But if those decisions are reflecting a legacy of discrimination, where people of color were given longer prison sentences than white people for the same crime, or because of circumstances, they were more frequently arrested for the fact patterns that wouldn't have put a white person in prison, then a system of arrest scoring based on that data will discriminate. Julia Engel did a wonderful series for ProPublica analyzing some of this data, and found that these systems are used in judicial proceedings across the country and are sentencing people of color far more to longer, more rigorous sentences than white people who've committed roughly the same crimes. So just because the computer said it doesn't mean it's right, and we need to, uncover the biases that have gone into training and, actively try to counter.
So let me stop you there. So I don't think a lot of people are aware of this. So, and this is covered in the book, computers are used in sentencing guidelines and even setting bail in a lot of cases. Is that correct? Please tell us about that, because I bet a lot of people don't know that.
Many prosecutors will use these systems, thinking it's fairer to use a database and a computer system that can analyze, lots of cases than to rely on the perceptions of one or a few people trying to offer uniform sentences. But then they'll rely on databases or companies who claim that their sentencing algorithms are trade secret. So when the defendant asks, can I see why I was recommended a long sentence? The company intervenes to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't share that because then somebody might go and copy our commercially valuable data. Well, we need our systems to be analyzing the people's right to freedom as more important than competitively sensitive data. But also we need researchers to be able to investigate those systems, not just by probing it from the outside, but picking them apart to uncover these biases and make them more fair.
Well, and that leads into my next question, and then I'll come to Ken and Harry for some input on this. And that is that a lot of these algorithms, especially computers, used to be predictable. I mean, I'm a software engineer. When I tell a computer to do something, it'll do it, even if I told it to do the wrong thing. But at least it's predictable, and I can explain why it did what it did. But in the age of AI, and particularly in machine learning, we are feeding a bunch of data. We are training computers to do things, and it's kind of figuring them out on their own. And then we don't really know how it came up with those decisions, but we somehow trust them. So that has a lot of really weird implications. And one of the ones I'd like you to talk about from an anecdote perspective is the higher view scenario. Why is it that all of a sudden this new thing called machine learning means that computers aren't predictable necessarily anymore, and we can't explain why it made a decision, and then what effects that's having on society?
So higher view is a system of first round interviews, as it were, for in hiring practices, and you answer some questions into a and record yourself being. You have a video recording made of your answers to these questions, and then one of two things happens. This is at the time we wrote the book. Maybe the practices have changed since then. The higher view would either just share the video with a number of companies, and so to save them the expense of flying you to 3 different locations to be interviewed, or would run the video through their proprietary algorithms, and on the basis of that decide whether you were worth interviewing in person based on some inferences about your audio and video behavior matched against what they or their client companies had decided were successful and unsuccessful employees who'd been hired in the past. And so, the opportunities for bias on the basis of historical exclusion are very plainly absent. I mean, some of these, this is not the higher view system, but there have been other examples. There are actually published papers where some machine learning algorithm has been applied to lots of photographs, and they supposedly successfully could discriminate people who were criminals from people who weren't criminals. And it turned out the algorithm had just learned that all of the non-criminals were wearing neckties or something like that. It was just an artifact of the of the database that they had trained the systems on. So these are very serious issues, and not just in and I'm glad we've moved off of law enforcement and talked about other things where the harms are less obvious. I mean, okay, you apply for a job, you don't get the job. You're not entitled to the job. They can hire anybody they want, within, broad non-discrimination criteria. But the problem is that because these systems are proprietary, as Wendy said, we have no way of knowing what kind of unfairness may have been embedded into them by their historical practice. And I'll give one other examples on this. There's a noted computer science scholar whose first name is Latanya. She's African American, and she noticed that when you type in her name, I think I've got this story correctly right, you were more likely to get an ad popped up that said, would you like to get the criminal record on Latanya, than if you had typed in, Harry. And, but again, is this really true? It's very hard to know because it's all embedded somewhere in some recommendation algorithm that's embedded deep in the system. So we have to make some progress on honoring the fact that individuals have rights, and B, that businesses have obligations, and C, that certainly where individuals directly meet the criminal justice system, that's probably the most important thing. But these other areas where we're acting more as consumers and employees and so on are also very important, and they're extremely non-transparent right now.
Just to add a couple more things. First of all, I just want to make sure that we recognize it's not, as Harry said, not just the criminal justice system. It might be organ transplant recommendations. It might be medical diagnoses. It might be all sorts of things that are more consequential than whether you get a first interview at the age of 21. They might be really life altering. And the other comment is that it's not merely the case that some company doesn't let you see inside their black box. The very nature of machine learning is that we don't know how to look inside the black box. I have a 12-year-old granddaughter, and if I say to her, "Why did you do that?" she can't tell me. She just said, "Well, I just did." She says, "Because." And if we take that as the model, if we say machine learning system has simply accumulated all of this experience and is now making a decision based on its accumulated experience, and you say to that system, "Why did you do that?" Its technical answer might well be because, my weights told me to. But a real answer is it's just going to say because.
Right, and that's scary. I mean, like, even as a software engineer, it's unsettling for me that I can't explain why the computer just did what it did.
And I should, yes, I want to just follow up and emphasize the point just made. Very often, because of the primitive state, I mean, it's functional but theoretically primitive state of machine learning, the issue isn't even that the company won't tell you how its software came to that decision. The company itself has no idea how it came to that decision.
Exactly.
It's embedded, the fourth layer of the neural net had a weight of 0.746 instead of 0.747. But how did it get there? Well, after analyzing, a billion videos, that's just the way the parameters came out in the middle of this big neural net. So there is work being done on explainable AI and how to do this and so on. But there's lots of money to be made on systems that don't have any such safeguards or explanations built into it. They just work for reasons nobody quite understands.
Yeah. And you might have created a system for a perfectly benign purpose. I create a system whose only purpose is to make sure that my users use it more because I really want them to stay there. And then I discover that the system on its own decided to tell young girls about losing weight. I didn't create a system to harm teenagers. I created a system to just keep my users there more. And I can't even look. Another reason you can't look in is because that system is constantly evolving, just like my 12-year-old granddaughter. And I have no way to say on January 18th, why did you do something? Because it's gone. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's crucial. The internet, when it was originally conceived as ARPANET back in the day, I don't think any of the people who were there at the time could foresee, no matter how prescient they were, where things would end up today. But it's certainly around the time of the web when it came around. I think that there was definitely this kind of utopian idea that it's going to be this egalitarian, level playing field. It was going to be world spanning. It doesn't respect borders. It would bring us all together and share, the wealth of human knowledge. Nevertheless, we have still managed to install gatekeepers, and there are still mechanisms built into the web, and like net neutrality. This was a topic that was huge years ago that for some reason I don't hear much about anymore. So your book just talks about this a little bit. Tell us a little bit about net neutrality, where that's at now, and the concept of gatekeepers. What do you mean by that? How is it that parts of the internet are less accessible to others?
I'll start with the underlying principle of network neutrality, which was that is that service providers should, provide connections to all traffic equally and not discriminate based on, who's paying them more or their political preferences for some traffic over others, and should provide a neutral infrastructure for communications activity. And the discussion has gone in a few different directions from there. At the physical, and network communications protocol layer, we have pretty good access to anything we might be seeking out. There's pressure on service providers to block criminal traffic, both traffic of those trying to use the net to commit crimes and frauds, or those trying to disseminate information like child sexual abuse material, which is not lawful anywhere. But access to lawful traffic, lawful content, lawful communications is, at least in the United States, in pretty good shape. Elsewhere in the world, we see experiments like the zero rating proposals and projects that companies like Facebook, now Meta, have offered to provide free access to Facebook traffic and more expensive access to other non-Facebook traffic. That shapes the views of what people are able to see, shapes more of their activity toward the Facebook platform, and changes what they're able to converse about, and how easily, as well as how easily others are able to compete with Facebook to offer new services and new sources of content or community or entertainment. Another angle of discussion is often, should there be application level neutrality? Should app stores be required to provide access to all comers? And how is our view filtered by, what applications Google or Apple permits in their app stores?
That's a big debate right now with the app stores, because Apple, there's a lot of focus on trying to make Apple open up its app store, kind of like Google did with its Play Store. So there's that aspect, absolutely, that has a gatekeeper aspect. And then there's this notion of the splinter net, where countries are trying very hard to impose borders on the internet that were never there before, and these technologies that we can come up with that might allow for suppressing, CSAM material now may be used in another country like China or other countries to suppress information for Uyghurs or dissidents or things like that. Talk a little bit about the political aspects of how the internet is being balkanized and broken up, and it's how some countries are trying to make a different internet for their country.
I'll just confirm that this is the case, and I mean it's very sad for those of us who came of age during that, the internet utopia, as unrealistic as it always was to have the notion of a borderless internet. But I have some personal experience with this. I have good friends in Hong Kong. And I used to visit Hong Kong physically all the time, and I used to communicate with my friends over the internet all the time. And now there are things that I don't dare talk to them about, because I know that my communications are being filtered. I can't point them to a link and tell them to go read something, because if they click on that link, the party bosses will find out what they're doing. So yeah, the internet is a tool, and yes, it can be used for the free and open dissemination of information, but there's nothing intrinsically in the technology that says that's the only way it can be used. And particularly as we develop technologies for what we in liberal democracies would consider legitimate information control, detecting and child pornography and going after the people who are disseminating it, those same tools can be used for detecting and tracking down the people who are talking about Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong, and so it is it's a whole set of geopolitical issues.
And Terry, you brought a whole bunch of things together in a very nice way there. We talked about gatekeepers. One of the things that Harry's story relates to directly is in many ways, Google is the ultimate gatekeeper in the sense that if you can't find it, it doesn't exist on the internet. And we all know that when we do a Google search, we're not seeing what's on the internet. We're seeing what Google tells us is on the internet. Harry's story relates directly to if I do a Google search for a particular topic here and I do the same Google search in Hong Kong or Beijing, I will see very different results, right? And so that's a different form of gatekeeper. That's not, in a sense, somebody not letting it in, but saying, maybe directly or indirectly to Google, you have to shape your search results in the following way. And finally, we see that we have to think a lot about what are the implications of things that we're doing in a particular way. Because very often things that we thought were benign turn out not to be benign when they get used slightly differently, or when the scale is different than when we imagined, or the speed is different than what we imagined.
Well, the other thing I think that brings all this together is that in a lot of ways, because of the algorithms that are in place on the internet, we become our own gatekeeper, which is because we build bubbles. We build filter bubbles because Google and Facebook and the other these companies are trying to give us more of what they think we like. And what I think blows a lot of people's mind is, and I tell people to do this experiment if they can, is take your laptop and take their laptop, sit next to each other, and both of you search on the same thing and tell me what Google tells you.
I think one other piece I'd add to this conversation, and another of the changes that we've seen since the first edition of the book, is the rise of content moderation as a feature of a lot of our networks. First, the rise of social networks and these sort of group curated conversations, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or YouTube, and those have a lot of infrastructure underneath them of the platform owners moderating to whether it's to keep off information that's harassing or terrorist content, or content that's promoting violence or misinformation. And lately we've seen a lot of political fighting about whether those decisions are politically motivated or neutral. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that they can't be purely absolute. But the platforms would look a lot different and would probably be unusable if they weren't allowed to engage in some moderation, if they weren't able to keep out the spam and keep out the promotion of violence. We'd have no way to use them because we'd be drowned out by that. So should that be done by private companies? Should that be done by governments? Should that be done by user-driven collectives? I think we're still in the stage of experimentation where there are different communities with different rules and ways of setting those rules.
Yeah.
Let me also, I just want to throw in another thought here that based on Carrie, your question. So one of the things which our book, wants people to understand is that words are designed to produce metaphorical images in our minds, which is the only way that we can use technology is by relying on certain kinds of metaphors. But the metaphors are very misleading sometimes. So, my favorite is the tool that we use for web searching and looking at pages, which is called a browser. Use a browser to view pages, right? That's what, that's how the internet works. Well, first of all, you're not browsing, you're sending a request, and then somebody is sending something back to you. If somebody else asks for the same web page, they don't necessarily get the same page back. Mm-hmm. And, that may be what you want. I mean, maybe you want yours in French if you're sitting in France. So there are good reasons why the functionality should be some degree, customizable. But it's you give the example of two different people, the same person using two different computers. I use the example in my mind of using my computer after my daughter has been using my computer for a while, and all of a sudden I'm getting advertisements for shoes with stiletto heels, and I insist that is not a result of my web browsing habits, but Google doesn't know that, right?
Right.
So, so pages and browsing and viewing, you're not viewing, you're viewing the screen, but you're not viewing the thing at its source. The source is concocting something to send specifically to you. And, sometimes that's produces exactly the results we want. And sometimes it's results in, what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, right? Where so much information has been collected about you that people are making lots of money by customizing things in ways which are not necessarily in society's best interests.
Right. I mean, I wonder, Carrie, whether your listeners are aware of just how much information about who you are, where you are, what kind of browser you have, what version of the operating system you're running on, whether you've been typing mostly with your left hand or your right hand, is available every time you click on something. Sometimes that's made visible to them. Most of the time it's not.
Yeah, it's actually astounding the amount of information that is captured, and something a lot of people I don't think are also aware of. There's a lot of technologies built into websites that could do what they call replays, where from a marketing standpoint, the companies want to see how people interact with their website. But what that means is someone far away could actually go back and replay everything you did while you were on that website, including where your mouse went, where it hovered, how long it took, how you scrolled, because some of it is, well, what ads do they get, attracted to? But that's also really just super creepy, and I don't think people understand.
Tell a story.
Go ahead.
I want to tell a story, Carrie, as you're a software engineer, and maybe this is a story that I learned about another major technology company. It's not Microsoft and it's not Meta. I'm not going to say which one it is. But an engineer who worked at this company said, he learned something on his first day about how they design their website. He said, the CEO instructed them about how they decide about which new features, how to implement new features. So somebody comes up with a bright idea that say this website's this would work better if we knew what our customers, how many children they had, or something like that. And so let's implement, do all the machine learning to figure out how to customize the product delivery based on, adding that piece of data to what we know about the customer. And the CEO says, okay, if you come up with an idea like that, the first thing we're going to do is to do a 404 test. Okay, what's a 404 test? 404 is the code that you get back when you try to access a web page that isn't actually there. A 404 test is you just implement the button, and you say, tell us how many children you have, and you deploy that to 0.001% of the installed page views, right? And, if nobody pushes the button, you're not going to go ahead and then bother implementing the feature. But if the importance of understanding the whole business is driven by figuring out what information about us is useful in terms of increasing the company's profits. I mean, that's the it's capitalism. It's the way capitalism works, right? We generally want that, but it now involves collecting such amounts and such minute detailed information. I mean, frankly, they can probably infer how many children I have just by looking at my browsing habits. So I'm not even sure you need to ask the question anymore.
Right.
So I just want to take this one step a little further because we're talking about what changed since the first edition of the book to now. And when the third edition of the book comes out in 2050, and people are doing most of their browsing using their eyeglass-mounted browsers, whatever. Remember, somebody will be collecting eye movement. Somebody will be looking at, what your facial expression was, whether you seemed pleased, not just whether your mouse lingered, how long you paused in front of some object on the store shelf. So all of these things that we talk about are impacted enormously when the volume of information and the types of information increase exponentially. And computers understand human affect. They understand all sorts of other things about your behavior.
Data collection that you're referring to, Ken, is the only way that the metaverse can work right? Only if those goggles that you put on to enter the metaverse can see where you're looking on the screen and can tell whether you're happy or unhappy at something. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to interact with the other avatars in the metaverse. So it's actually essential for that product, which is a current product, to work properly, to collect exactly the sort of data you're talking about eye movements and facial expressions. And God knows where that data is going and what else is being done with it.
And this will be our next example of, didn't somebody consider the implications when they implemented this highly desirable feature that we all wanted? I'm desperate to be able to take a photograph without moving my finger, this kind of thing. That will really sell me on some product. And so they implement that thing, and now all of a sudden we have some potentially nefarious consequence.
Well, and here's where things, if you really want to get dystopian, this is where things to me will get really weird, is when the feedback comes to the point where I can tell how it's reacting based on how I do things. What about when I start changing my own habits? Like I learned to not look to the left. I learned to not blink as much. I learned to not smile I start changing my behavior, my facial expressions to alter the feedback that I'm giving, and it comes full circle.
One place where people are getting that feedback already is the rise of automated proctoring programs. When people are taking exams and are forced to opt into surveillance of their environments in order to prove that they're not getting any outside assistance, students are reporting that they have to engage in almost scripted behavior to tell the system that they are paying attention, and that anyone whose behavior falls even a little bit outside those norms, say they have a condition where they have to use the restroom a little bit more frequently, or to help them pay attention they need some aids to fidget with, that the system interprets that as cheating and marks them off. So do they have to conform their behavior to what the computer expects of them? Or can we make these computerized systems change to respect the diversity of people who are using them?
Yeah. And just while we're on a completely dystopian bent, if today we think the internet consists of that which Google tells us, what will it be like when we're wearing goggles or eyeglasses and what we see is what Meta tells us the world is?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I've thought about that quite a bit. All right, a couple more questions here before we go. And one is a little bit of a departure, maybe a little less personal, but I still think it's a fascinating topic because we talk about bits being blown to bits and how everything now is bits. Everything is stored as bits. And for eons, we have stored things on parchment and carved things into rocks and painted things on cave walls that have managed to survive all these years. And now all of a sudden, everything is bits and bytes, and it's perfect. It will never degrade. It's copyable perfectly, and yet it seems like we're one electromagnetic pulse or still solar storm away from losing all of it. What are the implications to the fact that now everything is bits?
Well, Harry there's a fabulous story in the book. We'll let Harry relate it about laser discs.
Well, yes. So in 1086, that is to say, more than 900 years ago, a book called the Doomsday Book was written in England, which was a compendium of demographic and property information about every household in England. And you can go today and flip through the pages. Well, you can't because they flip through the pages. They have it open to one page, but you can see the book is bound and is sitting in the British Museum and is perfectly as readable today as it was. And on the 900th anniversary of the Doomsday Book, the British government produced an up-to-date version where they had aerial photographs of everywhere in England, and they produced a complete census of the country, and they recorded this for public access because this was valuable information that would be of general interest to the public to be able to use. And 15 years later, it could not be read at all because it was put on 15-inch video discs, and the company who made 15-inch video discs went out of business, and they literally had to go back to the source materials and try to figure out what data structures had been used to compose this in order to recover. I think they finally did recover it and transfer it onto some other medium, but I think this is an area where the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, has done some work to talk about, survivability and refreshing for the future. But, when you see the impact of war in such as, hot wars, of the kind that we're now, witnessing in Europe, you do have to wonder whether the priority that we may, in times of peace and prosperity, be able to put on preserving digital information as technological media change, whether that will be as big a priority as preventing people from starving and so on. So I think it's a very serious question.
Yeah, and you mentioned the format thing, because think about who has CD-ROMs anymore, who has floppy drives anymore, and I struggle with this because I've got family photos that are digital at this point, either that I've digitized because I've scanned them or whatever, and just every so often I find that, oh my gosh, it's an old format, or family videos, I find it's an old format that's like not supported. I can't find a player to play it anymore, and so I have to search out some specialized software to convert it, and hopefully it'll do it properly. And this is where we're at now. We don't have, I don't think we wouldn't have a digital archive standard.
And we can rely on cloud services, but, cloud services are not our own property, right? I mean, if we have Google store ourselves, what happens when Elon Musk buys Google or whatever, I mean, we laugh, but we see small examples of this. My wife recently retired from a job that she'd had for more than 40 years. And, 6 months later, she said, oh, what was so-and-so's phone number? And that, that was all stored on the office computer. And she lost access to that computer and all the data behind it. It's a whole piece of her life seems to have disappeared because, she didn't download everything. She probably wouldn't have been allowed to download everything,
Yeah.
Right. Or the fact that it's quite easy to just look in Wikipedia to see a list of dead word processors and realize that even if you could find a floppy disk reader, you can't find WordPerfect 3.8.
Right.
In order to read that, because bits inherently have no meaning. And bits only have meaning when they are consumed and repurposed by some piece of software. And if that piece of software no longer exists in any form, then the bits that you happen to have preserved perfectly have no significance.
Right. Yeah, you'd almost have to preserve a computer. They're running the software plus the data to try to access it down the line.
And I'll just add one more force that's often coming in up against the preservation and emulation to preserve availability, and that's copyright. That a lot of the copy protection systems imposed, or the measures to protect copies for the copyright holder, go against the archivist's principle of lots of copies keep stuff safe.
Right.
Make copies available in various formats so that we can find them later. Runs up against the copyright holder's demand to restrict access so that they can charge for every byte.
All right. So one more question before we go. And this has been amazing. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. I've got so many more questions, even some I didn't get to. But let me just go around the horn one last time before we go and give you a chance. Tell me what you think are some of the most promising developments that are coming, and what worries you most. So looking ahead as futurists, as technologists, and given what you've seen so far, what are you looking forward to, and what are you worried about?
All right, I'll take that in a few words. I think the most promising thing that I see is not a technological development, but it's a social development, and it may be a United States development and a European development more than it is elsewhere in the world. But it's the recognition of privacy as a fundamental human right, and the need for the governments to figure out some way to protect individual privacy at the same time as making it possible for the data of the world to be used for constructive purposes. So I'm oddly optimistic that societies will get a piece of this figured out, or at least make some progress on it in the next decade.
And what are you most worried about?
That they won't, or that the courts in the United States will declare that any attempt to control what private industry can do with our data is somehow colliding with other rights which corporations allegedly have to exploit our data.
Absolutely. Wendy, how about you? What do you look forward to? What worries you? What keeps you up at night?
I'm still excited by the promise of the democratization of technology access, that there's greater push to make the programming and the tools available to all, and that as computer access and devices are cheaper, more people can join the online community, and we can learn from a whole lot more experiences and more creators and creative people. And what worries me is the fate of democracy, that we are seeing more moves to control our communications, and more attempts to subvert that, and the filter bubbles, or bubbles of information spheres, leave many of us not even able to talk to one another across the divide. And if democracy depends on being able to persuade, first we need to be able to reach those who would be persuaded and try to convince them. And as we fragment our communications platforms and the information we get from them, we may not have that chance.
All right. Well, last and certainly not least, Ken, what about you?
Well, to maybe take this in a slightly different direction, I'm delighted to see the progress in what technology is able to do. I enjoy it. I look forward, as I get older and my grandkids want to take the car keys away, I look forward to having a car that can drive itself. But the thing that actually troubles me looking out, perhaps not as far as we might imagine, is that the capacity of technology to do an enormous range of what constitutes meaningful work today may radically alter the nature of our society, as more and more and more of the kinds of things that people get paid to do get done more effectively by machines. And we have really not come to terms at all with what our society will be like when such a large percentage of work goes away.
Well, Ken, Harry, Wendy, this was a wonderful talk. Again, we only scratched the surface of the book. There's so many more great things in there. So I encourage listeners to check that out for sure. It's got some wonderful, wonderful stories in it. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your views today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed talking with those guys. We talked off air a little bit too and had some fun discussions. And of course, I captured some of that for the patrons. You guys will be getting that extra bonus content on Thursday as usual, including an interesting story about Mark Zuckerberg at the beginning of Facebook. We'll also talk about the extent to which, AI may be replacing entire occupations. And we've been saying this for years about machinery replacing jobs and computers replacing jobs. And of course, to some degree they have. But honestly, a lot of that has been, more, blue collar or manual labor jobs, maybe in terms, certainly for machinery. But now with the advent of AI and machine learning, it's not uncommon now to be replacing entire realms of, prestigious white collar jobs. Like my grandfather was a radiologist, and a lot of the work of radiology today, finding tumors and things like that, is being done by computers. We'll also talk about the use of AI in the military and, killer drones and killer robots. It's the only reason we really don't have much more of that than we do today is policy, right? I mean, we've decided that we want to keep humans in control of drones that are capable of killing people, but there's no reason why we could not turn them loose to some other AI algorithm. Anyway, that's some of the bonus content that the patrons will be getting on Thursday. A couple other quick notes before we go. I was just interviewed on another podcast, on the Weird Marketing Tales podcast. And it was only a little bit about marketing in my particular case, because I'm not a marketing guy. But we did talk about, privacy and how that might impact things like analytics. And just talked about security and privacy tips in general. So if you're interested, there's a link in the show notes. You can check that out. The reason I knew the guy who did this was he actually helped to revamp my website. So anyway, he invited me on his show, and I, of course, said yes. Next week will be my best and worst gift guide for 2022, with Black Friday right around the corner and the Christmas shopping season on the horizon. That's always a good time to be thinking about, what gifts may or may not be good, and at least in terms of security and privacy, because a lot of us probably don't think about it in those terms. And that's why you've got me. And after that, of course, will be the huge, colossal 300th episode of the podcast. 300 straight weeks of Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. And I've already recorded my interview with Bruce Schneier. It was a lot of fun. We talked about all sorts of different subjects, and he had some really, really interesting perspectives. And he's already committed to coming back for the 400th episode. So we've definitely established precedent. All right, everybody, that's it for this week. Take care. And until next week, as always, stay safe out there and don't get caught with your drawbridge down.